Hey guys, it's Kim here with Fairly Fiber Fun. Thank you for joining me on part 1 of this very special Tunis order video. I'm not sure at the moment what I'm going to call it. I will label it later. But I am doing this video in 3 parts. Right now you're watching me get set up for a dye session. But while I'm setting up and getting everything ready, I thought I would give you a little bit of backstory. So a very sweet farmer friend of mine that lives where I want to live in Madison County, Georgia. She's the owner of Sheep Cote Farm, her and her husband, and they raise Tunis sheep. I am putting acid in the jars because I want the dye to strike really, really quickly. Okay, back to the story. So one day when I was over at their house, she asked me if I would make her a scarf from her sheep that she could wear and, talk about her sheep and how well the wool takes the dye and, what you can sort of do with their wool and things like that. And I said, sure. So we talked and she told me colors that she was interested in and what kind of drapey scarf she wanted, and we picked out a pattern, and I took enough roving home from a local mill. I don't know which mill she used, and I did a practice dye session and wrote down the recipe, and that's the recipe I'm following in this video. So this is the official dye job for her scarf, and I the acid in the dye jars and then the dye in there and boiling water, mixed them really good. I do have 2 sets of jars that I'm using because I'm dyeing this in 2 sections. I split the fiber in half so that I can spin one half to one bobbin, the other half to another bobbin, and then ply it together for a really visually interesting and textured 2-ply yarn. And the end result that I have in mind is exactly what the knitting turned out to be. So I'm really, really happy to get this dye job right on the money. Once the dyes have been mixed up, the jars are sitting for a while I get everything else ready. I don't want to use the dye right away. I want to let it sit for about 15 or 20 minutes. Now, for this dye job, I'm actually doing a really low immersion dyeing technique so that the dyes will pretty much stay right where I want them. So there's almost no water in the pots. I did pre-soak with acid, and then I added acid to the jars. So just pouring the dye in there, whatever's in the jar, and a little bit of water, and then poking it in to kind of spread it out. I do want white spots. I want undyed sections, and I will flip the fiber over, which you will see later, to put another color on the bottom. So right now I'm doing 3 colors on the top, and I'm not giving you my recipe because I'm not looking at it. Otherwise I probably would tell you which colors I'm using, but I will put those colors in the show notes so you get kind of an idea of what I was going for here. But you can see the colors are really, really extreme. Now, before I start adding dyes, I did heat the fiber. So it is preheated on the stove, ready to go. And I'm pouring warm dye on warm fiber. This is going to eliminate felting. So just a little side note there for you. So I'm essentially doing the same thing in both dye pots, knowing full well they're going to turn out different, and that's perfectly fine. I'm going for as much difference, as much variation as I can get with these colors. And even in the dye pots, it looks radically different. But it's so pretty. Look at that. Gorgeous. A little bit more coverage on the first one than on the second one, but still really, really pretty. And now flipping it over to get the other side once all the dye has been exhausted. And then again, I still want some undyed sections, so I'm not going to cover it too terribly thoroughly. The same thing on the second pot, and then kind of spotting the dye the last color of dye on the back side of the fiber for more variation in color. And I do want some muddying of colors, some blending, so not being picky about keeping the colors separate at all. And it's pour a little, poke it around, see if I need any more, pour a little, poke it around. And the whole time you can see the steam coming off these pots. It's really hot, so the dye is striking immediately with the heat and the acid in the fiber and the acid in the dye. It is really striking fast. Once this is done, I let it sit for about 40 minutes on heat and then let it cool and take the fiber out. Now this is the fiber all dry and ready to go. Isn't that gorgeous?